The wind carried sand across the barren expanse of New Mexico territory, stinging the eyes of anyone foolish enough to face it head-on. It was the summer of 1882, and the sun blazed down mercilessly upon the hard-scrabble homestead that sat like a weathered bone in the middle of nowhere. The land was unforgiving. Cracked earth stretched for miles, broken only by stubborn sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree that stood twisted against the sky like arthritic fingers reaching for rain that rarely came. Sarah McKenna stood in the doorway of her small wooden cabin, her calloused hand shading her eyes as she surveyed what was now hers alone. The homestead wasn't much, 160 acres of dust and dreams, but it was all she had left of Thomas. Her husband had been dead 3 months now, and still she found herself looking toward the horizon at dusk, half expecting to see his familiar silhouette returning from the fields. She remembered that day with painful clarity. Thomas had been working on the new well, desperate to find water before the worst of summer set in. The other men from town had warned him the shaft was too deep, the walls unstable, but Thomas McKenna was nothing if not stubborn. "Sarah, my love," he'd said that morning, kissing her forehead as dawn broke. "By nightfall, we'll have the sweetest water in the territory." By nightfall, she was a widow, pulling his broken body from the collapsed well with the help of neighbors who shook their heads and muttered about the foolishness of ambitious men. The memory made her chest tight, and she forced herself to turn away from the horizon. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. The small vegetable garden behind the house needed water from the old well. The chickens needed feeding, and the fence on the north pasture had come loose again. A woman alone had to work twice as hard to prove she belonged, and Sarah knew the eyes of the community were upon her. She'd felt those eyes at Thomas's funeral, heard the whispers that followed her like tumbleweeds. "Poor thing," the women murmured behind their hands. "How long do you suppose she'll last out there alone?" The men were less subtle in their assessment. Jake Morrison from the general store had already offered to buy the land at half its value. "Of course, be reasonable, Mrs. McKenna," he'd said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "A woman alone can't hold a homestead in country like this. It ain't natural." Natural or not, Sarah was determined to prove them wrong. She'd grown up on a farm in Ohio, knew how to work the land, how to stretch a dollar and make do with less. What she hadn't counted on was the loneliness, the vast, oppressive silence that descended with nightfall, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the settling of the wooden walls. As she hauled water from the old well, her arms aching with the effort, she noticed a dust cloud on the eastern road. Visitors were rare out here, and she set down the bucket, wiping her hands on her faded apron. The cloud grew larger, resolving into a single rider on a bay horse. Sarah didn't recognize the mount or the man's silhouette, and instinctively, she moved closer to the cabin where Thomas's Winchester hung just inside the door. The rider didn't approach, though he stopped at the edge of her property line, seeming to survey the land with the calculating eye of a prospector. After several long minutes, he turned his horse and headed back the way he'd come, leaving Sarah with an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. That evening, as she sat mending a torn shirt by lamplight, she heard horses approaching the Hendricks Ranch 2 miles south. The Hendricks were good people. They'd been the first to offer help after Thomas died, and Sarah wondered who would be calling on them so late. Through her window, she could see torches moving in the darkness, and the sound of raised voices carried on the wind, though she couldn't make out the words. The next morning, Mary Hendricks appeared at Sarah's door, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "There's trouble brewing," she said without preamble, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered. "A man came by yesterday, stranger, goes by the name of Silas Crenshaw, claims he's got papers on half the homesteads in the valley, including yours." Sarah's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. Thomas filed all the proper paperwork. We have the deed, signed and witnessed." Mary's weathered hands trembled slightly as she raised her cup. "Crenshaw says there were irregularities, claims filed before the official land office opened. He's got money, Sarah, and connections back east. Already drove the Petersons off their place last month up in Cedar Valley. The Petersons? Sarah remembered them from the harvest dance last fall, a young couple with 2 small children, full of hope and plans. But they'd been there 3 years. Didn't matter. Crenshaw had papers, had the sheriff with him. They left with whatever they could carry in their wagon. Mary's eyes met Sarah's, full of sympathy and fear. He was asking about you specifically, about Thomas. Wanted to know if you had any menfolk to help work the place. Sarah's jaw tightened, so that had been him yesterday, sizing up her land like a vulture eyeing carrion. Let him come, she said, though her voice sounded braver than she felt. I've got Thomas's papers, all legal and proper. This land is mine. Mary reached across the rough table and squeezed Sarah's hand. You're a brave woman, Sarah McKenna, but brave don't stop bullets. My Carl says Crenshaw travels with hired guns, rough men from the mining camps. Maybe you should consider— No. The word came out sharper than intended, and Sarah softened her tone. I'm sorry, Mary, I know you mean well, but I can't leave. Thomas is buried on this land. We built this place together, board by board, dream by dream. If I leave now, what was it all for? After Mary left, Sarah walked to the small cemetery plot on the hill behind the house. Thomas's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross. She couldn't afford stone, and already the desert was trying to reclaim it, sand gathering in the carved letters of his name. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the rough wood. I won't let them take it, Thomas, she whispered. I swear to you, I'll hold this land. As if in answer, the wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the yard. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, promising rain that might or might not come. Sarah stood, squaring her shoulders against the wind. If Silas Crenshaw wanted her land, he'd have to fight for it. And despite what the town might think, despite the whispers and the pity, Sarah McKenna knew how to fight. That night, she cleaned Thomas's rifle, loaded it, and placed it by her bed. She checked the locks on the doors and windows, though she knew they wouldn't stop determined men. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the coyotes and the wind, she thought about the life she and Thomas had planned, children playing in the yard, crops growing tall in the fields, a bigger house when the good years came. Those dreams felt like dust now, as insubstantial as the sand that seeped through every crack and crevice. But the land remained. The land was real, solid beneath her feet, and it was hers. Whatever came next, whatever papers Silas Crenshaw claimed to have, Sarah would face it. She had no choice. This was her home, her life, and she would defend it with everything she had. The last thing she heard before sleep finally took her was the distant rumble of thunder, and somewhere, carried on the wind, the sound of approaching horses. The morning came heavy with storm clouds, casting the desert in an eerie twilight despite the early hour. Sarah had been awake since before dawn, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. She fed the chickens, checked the fence line, and tried to go about her normal routine, but her eyes kept drifting to the road. He arrived just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Silas Crenshaw was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, riding a black stallion that seemed too fine for the rough territory. 2 other riders flanked him, hired guns by the look of them, with low-slung holsters and eyes that never stopped moving. Sarah watched from the porch as they approached, her hand resting on the doorframe, inches from where the Winchester leaned. Crenshaw didn't dismount immediately. He sat his horse in her yard like he already owned it, rain beginning to darken his expensive coat. Above them, crows gathered on the fence posts, their harsh cries cutting through the humid air. The temperature had dropped with the storm's approach, and Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the cold eyes of the man before her. Mrs. McKenna, Crenshaw said finally, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. His voice was cultured, Eastern, the voice of a man who'd learned his manners in drawing rooms, not cattle drives. I believe we have business to discuss. State your business from there. Sarah replied, not moving from the doorway. "This is private property." Crenshaw's smile was thin as paper. "Ah, but that's precisely what we need to discuss. The ownership of this property." He reached into his saddlebag, producing a leather portfolio. "I have documents here that suggest otherwise." "My husband filed proper claim on this land. We have the deed, signed by Judge Barrett himself." "Judge Barrett?" Crenshaw said the name like it tasted sour. "Yes, I'm familiar with the late judge's enthusiasm for documentation. Unfortunately, his authority in these matters was questionable at best. You see, Mrs. McKenna, this land was previously claimed through the territorial office in Santa Fe. My claim predates your husband's by nearly 2 years." Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "Then why are you only coming forward now?" "I've been attending to business interests in California. It's only recently that I've had occasion to review my holdings here." He dismounted then, his boots squelching in the mud that was beginning to form. "May I come in? We could discuss this in a more civilized manner." "We'll discuss it here." His eyes hardened slightly, but the smile remained. "As you wish." He opened the portfolio, withdrawing several documents wrapped in oilcloth against the rain. "These are the original claim papers, filed in 1880. You'll note the official seal, the signatures of 3 witnesses." Sarah stepped forward despite herself, squinting at the papers he held up. The rain was coming harder now, and she had to wipe water from her eyes to see clearly. The documents looked official enough, but something caught her attention, a rusty stain across the bottom of one page, as if something had been spilled on it long ago. "I want to examine those more closely," she said. "Of course." But as Crenshaw extended the papers, a gust of wind caught them. One document fluttered free, landing in the mud at Sarah's feet. As she bent to retrieve it, she saw the signature at the bottom, and her breath caught. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and familiar. She'd seen it before on a receipt from the general store, on a note of condolence after Thomas died. Margaret Crenshaw. The signature read, "Silas's wife." "Your wife signed these papers?" Sarah asked, looking up at him through the rain. Something flickered in Crenshaw's eyes. Annoyance? Fear? "My late wife. Yes, she assisted with my business dealings." "Late?" Sarah stood slowly, the muddy document in her hand. "I'm sorry for your loss. When did she pass?" "6 months ago." His voice was flat now, emotionless. "A tragic accident. She fell from the ridge above Cedar Creek during a storm much like this one." Sarah remembered hearing about it. The young woman found broken on the rocks, her body not discovered for days. There had been whispers, quickly silenced, about bruises that couldn't have come from a fall. She looked again at the document, at that rust-colored stain, and a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the rain. "I'll need time to review these with my attorney," she said. Crenshaw's smile returned, sharp as a Bowie knife. "By all means, though I should mention that Sheriff Watson has already reviewed them and found them to be in order. He's prepared to enforce the lawful claim whenever necessary." One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, his hand moving casually toward his pistol. The threat was as clear as the lightning that split the sky overhead. "You have 30 days, Crenshaw continued, taking the document from Sarah's unresisting hand and returning it to his portfolio. "I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. McKenna. I'll pay you fair value for any improvements you've made to the property. It would be unfortunate if this matter had to be resolved through less pleasant means. Get off my land." The words came out low, dangerous, surprising even Sarah with their intensity. Crenshaw's eyebrows rose slightly. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. Get off my land. Come back with the sheriff if you must, but until then, you're trespassing." For a moment, the only sound was the rain drumming on the ground and the restless movement of the horses. The crows had fallen silent, watching. Then Crenshaw laughed, a sound like ice breaking. "Spirit," he said. I admire that in a woman, though it's often misplaced. He mounted his horse with practiced ease. 30 days, Mrs. McKenna. I suggest you use them wisely. They rode off slowly, taking their time, letting her know they weren't intimidated by her words. Sarah stood in the rain, watching until they disappeared over the rise, then stumbled back inside on shaking legs. She lit a lamp against the storm-darkened room and spread Thomas's papers on the table. Everything looked legitimate, the claim filed, the fees paid, the deed properly witnessed. But Crenshaw's documents had looked legitimate too, and that signature, that stain. Thunder shook the cabin, and in the brief illumination of lightning, Sarah saw her reflection in the window, a woman alone, hair plastered to her head by rain, face pale with fear and determination. She looked like a ghost, she thought, like someone already dead but too stubborn to lie down. She touched the deed, Thomas's careful signature at the bottom. He'd been so proud when they'd received it, had framed it and hung it on the wall like a painting. "This is our future, Sarah," he'd said. "Our children will inherit this land, their children after them." Now there might be no future at all. The storm raged outside, but Sarah barely heard it. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Crenshaw's wife had signed those papers, but why? And that stain that looked so much like old blood. She remembered Margaret Crenshaw from the few times they'd met in town. A pretty young woman with frightened eyes, always wearing long sleeves even in the heat of summer. Once at the general store, her sleeve had ridden up as she reached for something, revealing bruises in the shape of fingers around her wrist. She'd quickly pulled it down, meeting Sarah's eyes with a pleading look that begged for silence. Sarah hadn't said anything then. What was there to say? Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. That was the way of things out here. A man's business with his wife was his own, no matter how wrong it might be. But now Margaret was dead, and her signature was on papers that would steal Sarah's home. There had to be a connection, had to be something more to this than simple greed. The rain was letting up, the storm moving on toward the mountains. Sarah stood, suddenly decisive. She needed help, needed someone who understood the law better than she did. But more than that, she needed to know the truth about Margaret Crenshaw's death and those papers that bore her name. Tomorrow, she would ride to town, visit the courthouse, ask questions. It was dangerous. Crenshaw had made that clear, but what choice did she have? She couldn't fight him with guns. She had to fight him with truth. As she prepared for bed, checking the locks again, placing the rifle within easy reach, Sarah thought about Margaret Crenshaw. Had she been trying to leave her husband? Had those papers been part of some plan that had gone terribly wrong? And that blood stain, was it truly blood? And if so, whose? Outside, a coyote howled, long and mournful, and Sarah shivered. 30 days. Crenshaw had said 30 days to save her home or lose everything. She would not waste a single one. The memory came to Sarah in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded her and the wind whispered secrets through the cabin walls. It had been last spring, perhaps 2 months before Thomas died. She'd gone to town for supplies and found Margaret Crenshaw sitting on the bench outside the Mercantile, tears streaming down her face despite her attempts to hide them beneath her bonnet. Sarah had hesitated. It wasn't proper to intrude on another's grief, but something in the young woman's despair called to her. She'd sat down on the bench, not speaking at first, just offering her presence. After a while, Margaret had whispered, "He's going to kill me one day." The words had been so quiet Sarah almost thought she'd imagined them. But then Margaret had looked at her with those haunted eyes and said it again, clearer this time. "My husband, he's going to kill me, and no one will stop him." Sarah had tried to comfort her, suggested she speak to the sheriff, even offered her sanctuary at the homestead. But Margaret had shaken her head violently. "You don't understand. He owns the sheriff. He owns half this territory. There's nowhere I can run that he won't find me." That was when Margaret had pressed something into Sarah's hand, a rolled document tied with string. "Keep this," she'd said urgently. "Hide it, please. If something happens to me, you'll know what to do." Sarah had taken the document home, tucked it away in the old Bible without looking at it. Thomas had been alive then, and their problems had seemed manageable. Broken fences, scarce water, the eternal battle against the desert. Margaret Crenshaw's troubles had felt distant, like a storm on the horizon that might never arrive. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah lit a candle and retrieved the Bible from its place on the shelf. Her hands shook as she opened it, finding the document where she'd hidden it between the pages of Psalms. The string was stained dark. She realized now what that stain must be. Carefully, she unrolled the paper. It was a deed, identical to the one Crenshaw had shown her, but with crucial differences. This one was dated earlier, and Margaret's signature was accompanied by what looked like a bloody thumbprint. Below the signature, in Margaret's shaking hand, were the words, "Signed under threat of death, my blood bears witness to his cruelty." Sarah's breath caught. This was evidence, proof that Crenshaw had forced his wife to sign false documents. But there was more. Folded inside the deed was a smaller paper, a note in Margaret's handwriting. "To whomever finds this, my husband plans to steal the homesteads in Cedar Valley through false claims. He forced me to sign the papers, beat me when I refused. I've hidden the real documents, the ones that prove his fraud. They're in the old mine shaft at Copper Creek, wrapped in oilcloth beneath the fallen timbers. If I die, know it was no accident. Silas killed me as surely as if he'd put a gun to my head. Please, don't let him succeed. Margaret Crenshaw." Sarah read the note 3 times, her mind racing. The old mine at Copper Creek was a day's ride north, abandoned for years after it played out. If Margaret had hidden documents there, they might still be retrievable. But it was dangerous territory. Mountain lions denned in those hills, and the mine itself was unstable. She remembered the night Margaret died. There had been a terrible storm, worse than usual for spring. The next morning, word spread that she'd been found at the bottom of Cedar Creek Ravine. Silas had played the grieving widower perfectly, even paid for an elaborate headstone. "My beloved wife," it read. "Taken too soon." Sarah folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside her dress. She had evidence now, but would it be enough? A dead woman's words against a powerful man's money and influence? She needed those hidden documents Margaret mentioned. Without them, she had only accusations. As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made her preparations. She filled her canteen, packed hardtack and dried meat, checked her rifle. The ride to Copper Creek would be treacherous, especially alone, but she had no choice. Margaret had trusted her with this secret, had died trying to stop her husband's crimes. Sarah owed it to her, and to herself, to see this through. She was saddling her mare when she noticed fresh tracks in the dust near the corral. Boot prints, too large to be hers, circling her property in the early morning light. Someone had been here during the night, watching. The thought made her skin crawl, but it also strengthened her resolve. Crenshaw was already moving against her. She had to act fast. The journey north was lonely and hard. The trail wound through rocky canyons and across alkali flats that shimmered in the heat. Sarah kept her rifle across her saddle, eyes scanning for danger. Once, she spotted riders in the distance and had to hide among the rocks until they passed. Whether they were Crenshaw's men or simply travelers, she couldn't risk being seen. She reached Copper Creek as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The abandoned mining camp was a collection of rotting buildings and rusted equipment, testament to dreams that had turned to dust. The mine entrance yawned like a black mouth in the hillside, partially collapsed and forbidding. Sarah tethered her horse to a sturdy beam and lit a lantern. The mine shaft angled down sharply, and she had to pick her way carefully over fallen rocks and rotted support beams. The air grew cold and stale as she descended, and somewhere in the darkness, she heard the drip of water and the skitter of small creatures fleeing her light. The fallen timbers Margaret had described were about 100 feet in, a jumbled pile of wood that had once shored up the tunnel. Sarah set down her lantern and began carefully moving the debris, mindful of the tons of rock above her head. Sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cold. and her hands were soon raw from the splintered wood. Then she found it, an oilcloth bundle wedged beneath a massive beam. She pulled it free, unwrapping it with trembling fingers. Inside were more documents than she'd expected. Original land claims properly filed and dated. Receipts showing Crenshaw had bribed officials. Letters discussing the planned theft of homesteads. And at the bottom, a journal in Margaret's hand detailing years of abuse and her husband's criminal activities. Sarah was so absorbed in reading that she almost missed the sound, a subtle shift in the rocks above, a rain of pebbles that meant someone else was in the mine. She grabbed the documents and her lantern, but before she could move, a voice echoed through the darkness. "I thought I might find you here." She spun around to see Silas Crenshaw standing between her and the exit, a pistol in his hand. He must have followed her, must have been watching all along. In the lantern light, his face was a mask of cold fury. "My wife always was too trusting," he said, advancing slowly. "I knew she'd hidden something. I beat it out of her, where she'd put the documents, but the storm came before I could retrieve them. Then she tried to run." He shrugged. "The ravine was convenient. No one questions a woman falling in a storm." "You murdered her," Sarah said, backing away, clutching the papers. "I removed an obstacle," Crenshaw corrected. "Just as I'm about to remove another. You should have taken my offer, Mrs. McKenna. Now you'll have an accident too. These old mines are so dangerous. Collapsing tunnels, bad air. Tragic, really." Sarah's hand found the small pistol Thomas had given her, tucked in her skirt pocket. It wasn't much against Crenshaw's larger weapon, but she'd learned to shoot as a girl, hunting rabbits in Ohio. As Crenshaw raised his gun, she drew and fired in one motion. The shot was impossibly loud in the confined space. Crenshaw cried out, his gun flying from his hand as her bullet struck his wrist. Sarah didn't wait to see more. She grabbed the lantern and ran, documents clutched to her chest. As Crenshaw's curses echoed behind her, she burst from the mine into twilight, gasping clean air. Her horse whinnied nervously as she threw herself into the saddle, and then they were galloping down the trail, leaving Copper Creek and its ghosts behind. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. Crenshaw would come after her, wounded or not. She had the evidence now, but she still had to get it to someone who would listen, someone with more authority than the local sheriff. As she rode through the gathering darkness, Margaret's blood-stained deed pressed against her heart. She made her decision. The territorial capital was 3 days' ride east. The federal marshal there had a reputation for honesty. If she could reach him, if she could make him listen, maybe Margaret's death wouldn't have been in vain. Behind her, she thought she heard hoofbeats, but when she looked back, there was only darkness and the first stars appearing in the desert sky. Sarah urged her mare faster, racing against time and the violent man who would stop at nothing to keep his secrets buried. The deed with Margaret's blood on it seemed to pulse against her chest like a second heartbeat, evidence of a crime, a woman's last desperate attempt at justice, and perhaps Sarah's only hope of keeping her home. Sarah returned to her homestead to find chaos. The fence lines had been cut during her absence, and her small herd of cattle had scattered across the desert. The chicken coop lay in ruins, feathers scattered like snow across the yard. Most disturbing of all, the door to her cabin hung open, swinging in the wind. She approached carefully, rifle ready, but the vandals were long gone. Inside, furniture was overturned, dishes smashed, Thomas's books torn and scattered. They'd even ripped apart the mattress, searching for something, probably the documents she now carried. The message was clear. Crenshaw wouldn't wait for legal proceedings. Over the following days, the harassment escalated. Sarah would wake to find her water barrels emptied, the precious liquid soaking uselessly into the sand. Dead coyotes appeared on her doorstep. Once, she found her mare's mane and tail crudely shorn, a warning of what could happen next. The neighbors who had once offered help now kept their distance. When she rode to the Hendricks Ranch seeking assistance, Mary met her at the gate with downcast eyes. "I'm sorry. Sarah," she whispered. "Carl says we can't get involved. Crenshaw's men came by yesterday, said there'd be trouble for anyone who helped you." We have children to think of. Sarah understood. Even as her heart sank, fear was a powerful tool, and Crenshaw wielded it expertly. She was truly alone now, one woman against a man who commanded money, influence, and violence. The worst came on a scorching afternoon when the temperature soared above 100 degrees. Sarah had spent the morning trying to repair the fence, sweat soaking through her dress. When she heard the approaching horses, not one or two this time, but half a dozen. Crenshaw rode at the head of the group, his wrist bandaged from their encounter at the mine. Beside him was Sheriff Watson, his badge glinting in the harsh sun. The other men were hired guns, faces hard as the desert rock. "Mrs. McKenna," the sheriff called out, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm here to serve notice. Mr. Crenshaw has filed a complaint. You're to vacate these premises within 48 hours. "On what grounds?" Sarah demanded, though her mouth was dry as dust. "Assault," Crenshaw said smoothly. "You shot me, unprovoked, at Copper Creek. The sheriff has a warrant for your arrest." Sarah's mind raced. "I was defending myself. He threatened—" "Do you have witnesses?" Watson interrupted. "Anyone who can verify your version of events?" She knew the answer, and so did they. "He murdered his wife," she said desperately. "I have proof." "Enough," Watson said. "You can present your evidence at trial. For now, you're to come with me." Sarah backed toward her cabin. "No, this is wrong, Sheriff, and you know it." One of the hired guns moved his hand toward his pistol. Now, Crenshaw said mildly. "Let's not have any unpleasantness. Mrs. McKenna is grieving, not thinking clearly. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." He dismounted, approaching her with that snake smile. "Sign over the deed, and all charges will be dropped. You can leave peacefully, even take your belonging. I'll pay for your passage back east, wherever you'd like to go. It's a generous offer." "Go to hell," Sarah spat. His smile never wavered. "I thought you might say that." He turned to his men. "Burn it." "Now wait a minute," Watson started, but Crenshaw cut him off. "The lady refuses to vacate stolen property. We're within our rights to reclaim it." He pulled out a flask, and Sarah smelled kerosene. Of course, accidents happen. Lamp knocked over, sparks from the stove. These wooden structures are so vulnerable to fire. Sarah's home, her last connection to Thomas. Everything they'd built together. She watched in horror as one of the men splashed kerosene on the porch. "Stop!" the voice came from the road, strong and commanding. Everyone turned to see a rider approaching fast, rifle already drawn. Sarah recognized him. Samuel Morrison, Jake Morrison's younger brother. Unlike Jake, Samuel had always been fair in his dealings, and he'd been away for months, working the railroad camps. He reined in hard, positioning himself between Sarah and the men. "What's going on here, Sheriff?" Watson shifted uncomfortably. "Official business. Sam, best you move along." "Looks like arson to me," Samuel said evenly. His eyes found Sarah's. "You all right, Mrs. McKenna?" Before she could answer, Crenshaw spoke up. "Mr. Morrison, this doesn't concern you. The woman is a squatter and a criminal. We're simply enforcing the law." "Funny thing about the law," Samuel said. "I just came from the Capitol. Stopped at the federal marshal's office to report some claim jumping I heard about. Marshal's real interested in land fraud these days. In fact, he's probably a day behind me with a full posse." The lie was so smooth that Sarah almost believed it herself. She saw uncertainty flicker across Watson's face, calculation in Crenshaw's eyes. "You're bluffing," Crenshaw said. Samuel shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I showed him some interesting documents about false claims and a murdered woman. Either way, burning down Mrs. McKenna's home right now might look real bad when he arrives." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah held her breath, aware that violence balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and bullets would fly. Finally, Watson cleared his throat. "Mr. Crenshaw, perhaps we should wait. If the federal marshal is coming, He's lying. Crenshaw snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The federal government had been cracking down on land fraud since the territory hoped for statehood. Even his money might not protect him from federal prosecution. Maybe, Watson said, but I won't be party to burning a woman's home without proper procedures. We'll wait for the 48 hours. Crenshaw's face darkened, but he nodded curtly. Very well, 48 hours. Mrs. McKenna. Then we return, marshal or no marshal. He mounted his horse, pausing to look at Samuel. You've made a mistake. Morrison. I don't forget interference. They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Sarah and Samuel alone. She sagged against the porch rail, legs suddenly weak. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel dismounted, his face grim. I bought you time. Nothing more. That story about the marshal was a lie, I know. Sarah looked at him. This young man who'd risked Crenshaw's wrath for her. Why? He was quiet for a moment, then said, My brother told me what's been happening. Said it was none of our business, but I remember Mr. Thomas. He helped me once when I was in trouble, gave me work when no one else would. And what Crenshaw's doing? He shook his head. It ain't right. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since this began. I don't know what to do. I have evidence, proof of what he did, but no one will listen. Then we make them listen. Samuel said, You mentioned documents? Real ones? She nodded. Hidden in my root cellar now? But Watson won't care, and the territorial judge is 3 days away. There's another way. Samuel said slowly, Town meeting. If we can get enough people to hear the truth, see the evidence, even Watson would have to act. Crenshaw's bought a lot of folks. But not everyone. There are still good people here who remember Margaret Crenshaw, who've suspected the truth. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, fragile as a candle flame. Would they come? Would they stand up to him? For a neighbor in need? For justice? Samuel's jaw set with determination. Some will. I'll ride to the homesteads. Talk to folks. You gather those documents. Make copies if you can. Tomorrow night. We'll call a meeting at the church. As Samuel prepared to leave, Sarah caught his arm. Why are you really doing this? The truth. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes. Admiration. Perhaps something deeper. Because someone needs to, he said simply. And because I believe Thomas McKenna's widow deserves better than being driven off her land by a murderer. After he left, Sarah stood in her damaged home, surrounded by the destruction Crenshaw's men had wrought. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel entirely alone. Samuel Morrison had stood up for her, risked everything for justice. Maybe others would too. She went to the root cellar and retrieved Margaret's documents, spreading them on the table. By lamplight, she began making copies, her hand cramping as she wrote. Each word was a weapon against Crenshaw, each page a testament to Margaret's courage and suffering. Outside, coyotes howled in the darkness, but Sarah barely heard them. She had 48 hours to save her home, to ensure Margaret's death meant something, and now she had an ally. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But as she worked through the night, preparing for the fight of her life, Sarah felt Thomas's presence, and Margaret's too. Two ghosts standing with her against the darkness, whispering that justice, though delayed, might still prevail. Samuel Morrison proved true to his word. Throughout the next day, he rode from homestead to homestead, speaking with families who had known Thomas and Sarah, reminding them of kindnesses given and received. Meanwhile, Sarah worked to restore order to her ransacked home, all while keeping watch for Crenshaw's men. As the sun set, Samuel returned with encouraging news. The Hendricks will come, despite their fears. So will the Millers, the Johnsons, and old Ben Crawford. Even my brother Jake agreed to attend, though he's not happy about it. That's more than I hoped, Sarah said, gratitude warming her voice. Samuel dismounted, and she noticed the dust and exhaustion on his face. He'd ridden hard all day for her sake. There's something else, he said. I stopped by the telegraph office. Sent a message to a friend who works for the Territorial Gazette. If we're going to expose Crenshaw, we need witnesses beyond our small community. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. That could make things more dangerous. They're already dangerous. Samuel's expression was grave. Crenshaw won't stop with you. The Petersons were just the beginning. If he succeeds here, every small homesteader in the valley is at risk. That evening, as they prepared for the town meeting, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Samuel as he helped repair her broken fence. He was different from Thomas, younger, quieter, but with a steady strength that reminded her of bedrock. When their hands accidentally touched as they both reached for a hammer, she felt a jolt that surprised her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, pulling back. "Don't be." His voice was gentle. "Sarah, Mrs. McKenna. I know this isn't the time, but after this is over, however it ends, I want you to know." "Samuel," she interrupted softly. "Please, not yet. I can't think about anything beyond tomorrow." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course. Just know you're not alone. Not anymore." As darkness fell, they loaded the documents into saddlebags and rode toward town. Sarah wore her best dress, the black one from Thomas's funeral, and had pinned her hair severely back. She needed to look respectable, believable, even as her heart raced with fear. The church was lit with lanterns when they arrived, and Sarah was moved to see more people than expected gathering inside, along with those Samuel had mentioned. There were others, women mostly, who had known Margaret Crenshaw, who had seen the bruises and heard the whispers. But Crenshaw had his supporters too. Sheriff Watson stood at the back with several deputies, and Sarah recognized some of the hired guns lounging against the walls, trying to look casual. Crenshaw himself sat in a front pew, dressed like a gentleman, his bandaged wrist the only sign of their confrontation. Reverend Phillips, an elderly man who'd been in the territory since before it had proper towns, stood at the pulpit. "We're gathered here to hear grievances and seek truth," he began. "Let all who speak do so honestly, in God's sight." Samuel helped Sarah to the front. Her hands shook as she laid out the documents on the pulpit, but her voice was steady as she began. "Most of you know me. You knew my husband, Thomas. You know we claimed our land honestly, worked it with our own hands. Now, Mr. Crenshaw says he owns it, and many others besides." She held up the blood-stained deed. "This document was given to me by Margaret Crenshaw before she died. See the blood? See her words here, signed under threat of death. She knew what her husband was planning. She tried to stop him." A murmur ran through the crowd. Crenshaw stood, his face a mask of outraged dignity. "How dare you invoke my poor wife's name? Sheriff, arrest this woman for slander." Watson started forward, but Samuel stepped between them. "Let her finish." Sarah continued, reading from Margaret's journal, detailing the abuse, the forced signatures, the plans to steal homesteads throughout the valley. Women in the audience wept openly as she described Margaret's fear, her desperate attempts to gather evidence. "Lies," Crenshaw shouted. "Forgeries. My wife died in a tragic accident." "Then explain this," Sarah said, producing the letters between Crenshaw and various officials. "Your own handwriting, discussing bribes, planning to drive out homesteaders after your wife signed the false deeds." Old Ben Crawford stood up. "I want to see those papers." Others joined him, crowding forward. As the documents passed from hand to hand, the mood in the church shifted. Even some of Crenshaw's supporters looked uneasy. "And there's more," Sarah said. In her final note, Margaret told where to find the original deeds, the real ones that prove Crenshaw's claims are fraudulent. "I found them hidden at Copper Creek, where he followed me, threatened me with a gun." "She attacked me," Crenshaw snarled, "unprovoked, because you murdered your wife and tried to murder me." The church erupted. Some shouted support for Sarah, others defended Crenshaw. Sheriff Watson tried to restore order, but the crowd was beyond his control. Then a new voice cut through the chaos, a woman's voice, clear and strong. "She speaks the truth." Everyone turned. A woman in traveling clothes stood in the doorway, and Sarah gasped in recognition. It was Clara Hartley, Margaret's sister from back east. She looked like Margaret might have, if life had been kinder. The same delicate features, but without the fear. "I came as soon as I received word of my sister's death," Clara said, walking down the aisle. "I've spent weeks investigating what really happened. I've spoken to servants who heard the beatings, saw the bruises. I've found witnesses who saw Silas near Cedar Creek the night Margaret died, though he claimed to be in town." She stopped before Crenshaw, her eyes blazing. "You killed my sister, and now you try to profit from her death?" Crenshaw's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. I have influence, money, and I have the truth." Clara replied. She turned to the crowd. "My sister wrote to me before she died. She told me everything, the false documents, the plans, her fear. I've brought her letters, and I've brought something else." She produced a telegram. "Federal marshals are indeed coming. Mr. Morrison, your lie yesterday was prophecy. They'll be here by tomorrow." The church fell silent. Crenshaw looked around wildly, seeing his support evaporate like water in the desert. Even his hired guns were edging toward the door. "This isn't over," he hissed at Sarah. "You think you've won? You'll do nothing," Samuel said firmly. "Too many witnesses now. Crenshaw, too many people know the truth." Sheriff Watson finally found his backbone. "Mr. Crenshaw, I think you'd better come with me. There are questions need answering." Crenshaw tried to run, but the crowd blocked his path. As Watson led him away, he shot one last venomous look at Sarah. "You'll regret this, all of you." But his threats rang hollow now. The truth had been spoken, witnessed by dozens. Margaret's blood on the deed had indeed been evidence of her courage, her sacrifice, and ultimately, her justice. As the crowd dispersed, many stopping to apologize to Sarah for not helping sooner, Clara Hartley approached. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening to my sister when no one else would, for fighting when it would have been easier to run." "She saved me," Sarah replied, tears flowing freely now. "Her evidence, her courage, she saved all of us." Clara pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small photograph of Margaret, taken in happier times. "She would want you to have this, to remember that even in the darkest places, good people can make a difference." As Clara left to make arrangements for her sister's memorial, Sarah found herself alone with Samuel in the empty church. The weight of the past days suddenly crashed over her, and she swayed on her feet. Samuel caught her, held her steady. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe. Your home is safe." Sarah looked up at him. This good man who'd risked everything for justice, for her. The gratitude she felt was mixed with something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to name. "Thank you," she whispered. "For believing me." "For standing with me. Always," he said simply. Outside, the night was clear, stars brilliant in the desert sky. As they rode back to her homestead, Sarah thought about Thomas, about Margaret, about all the dreams that had been broken and rebuilt. The land would be hers now, truly and legally. But more than that, she'd found something she hadn't expected: community, justice, and perhaps, when her heart was ready, the possibility of love again. The deed with Margaret's blood on it had saved them all, a testament written in sacrifice that no amount of money or influence could erase. And in the vast silence of the desert night, Sarah could almost hear Margaret's voice on the wind. Finally, at peace. The town meeting had ended with Crenshaw's arrest, but Sarah knew better than to believe the danger had passed. Men like Silas Crenshaw didn't accept defeat easily, and his parting threat echoed in her mind as she tried to sleep that night. Samuel had offered to stay, to keep watch, but she'd sent him home. She needed to face this alone, to prove to herself that she could. It was near midnight when she heard them coming, horses moving slow and quiet, trying to mask their approach. Sarah had been expecting this. She slipped out of bed, already dressed, and grabbed Thomas's Winchester. Through the window, she counted 6 riders, dark shapes against the starlit desert. The hired guns had come, just as she'd feared. They dismounted at a distance, spreading out to surround the cabin. Sarah's heart pounded, but her hands were steady on the rifle. She'd faced worse odds at Copper Creek. At least here, she knew the terrain, knew every rock and shadow around her home. A voice called out. One of Crenshaw's men, a scarred gunslinger named Wade. "Mrs. McKenna! Come out peaceful like, Mr. Crenshaw just wants to talk." Sarah almost laughed. Talk with 6 armed men in the darkness? She stayed silent, watching their movements through the gaps in the shutters. "Have it your way." Wade called, "Boys, burn her out." They moved toward the cabin with torches, but Sarah was ready. She'd learned from their last visit, had prepared. The first shot from her rifle sent one torch spinning into the darkness. The second dropped a man who'd gotten too close to her water barrels. She aimed for his leg, not to kill, but to disable. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the night like deadly fireflies. Sarah moved from window to window, making them think she had help, making every shot count. Glass shattered around her, wood splintered, but she kept firing. Then she heard it. More horses. Riders coming fast from the direction of town. Her heart sank. More of Crenshaw's men. She couldn't fight off a dozen. But the voice that rang out wasn't what she expected. "Sarah, hold on!" It was Samuel, and he wasn't alone. The Hendricks brothers were with him, and Jake Morrison, and others. Neighbors who'd finally found their courage. The hired guns, caught between the cabin and the arriving riders, tried to regroup, but they were outnumbered now. And these weren't frightened townsfolk. These were homesteaders who knew how to shoot, who'd had enough of being bullied. The firefight was brief but intense. When the gun smoke cleared, 2 of Crenshaw's men lay wounded, the others throwing down their weapons in surrender. Wade tried to escape on foot but didn't get far before Carl Hendricks brought him down with a rope like a runaway calf. Sarah emerged from her cabin, rifle still in hand, to find Samuel dismounting, his face tight with worry. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, though her voice shook. "How did you know?" "Had a feeling Crenshaw wouldn't give up easy," Jake Morrison said, surprising her with his presence. "Sam convinced us to keep watch on the roads. Good thing, too." As the captured gunmen were tied up, Samuel pulled Sarah aside. "There's more news. A rider came in just after midnight. Crenshaw escaped." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Escaped? How?" "Had help. Apparently, someone slipped him a gun. He shot his way out, stole a horse. Sheriff Watson's forming a posse, but..." Samuel's expression was grim. "Crenshaw knows this country. He could be anywhere." The thought of Crenshaw free, plotting revenge, sent a chill through Sarah. But as she looked at the men who'd come to her aid, she felt something stronger than fear. "Let him run," she said. "He's lost his power here. His men are captured, his schemes exposed. He's nothing but a fugitive now." But even as she spoke bravely, she knew Crenshaw would be back. Men like him didn't forget, didn't forgive. This wasn't over. The next days passed intense vigilance. The federal marshals arrived as promised, taking custody of the captured gunmen and beginning a formal investigation. Clara Hartley provided her evidence, and more witnesses came forward, servants who'd worked for Crenshaw, officials who'd been pressured to cooperate with his schemes. Sarah tried to return to normal life, to repair her homestead and tend her land. Samuel helped, spending long days fixing fences and hauling water. They worked side by side, and in the quiet moments, she found herself drawn to his steady presence, his quiet strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel finally spoke what had been growing between them. "Sarah, I know it might be too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, but I need you to know. I've come to care for you, not just as a neighbor in need, but as a woman I admire, respect, and love." Sarah's breath caught. She'd felt it too, this unexpected stirring of her heart, but guilt warred with growing affection. "Samuel, you don't have to answer now," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know. I'll wait as long as you need. Forever, if necessary." She reached for his hand, calloused from work, warm and strong. "Thomas would have liked you," she said softly. "He would have wanted me to be happy again. But are you ready?" Sarah considered the question. Was she? Her heart still ached for Thomas. Always would. But life had to go on. And this good man beside her had proven himself in ways that went beyond mere attraction. Before she could answer, they heard horses approaching. Both tensed, hands moving to weapons. But it was Sheriff Watson with news. "We found Crenshaw's trail," he said. "He's holed up in the old Gonzales mine, about 20 miles south. I'm gathering a posse. Figured you'd want to know, maybe even ride with us." Sarah stood. "I'll get my rifle." "Sarah." "No," Samuel protested. "It's too dangerous. He killed Margaret. He tried to steal my home. Tried to kill me." Her chin lifted with determination. "I need to see this ended." The posse rode out at dawn. Sarah, Samuel, the sheriff, and 6 other men. The Gonzales mine was in rough country. All rocks and rattlesnakes. Perfect for an ambush. They approached carefully. Watson calling out for Crenshaw to surrender. The answer was gunfire. Crenshaw shooting from the mine entrance. The posse took cover, returning fire, settling in for a siege. Hours passed under the blazing sun. Water running low, patience wearing thin. Then Crenshaw made his mistake, thinking the posse was distracted. He tried to escape through a side tunnel, but Sarah had been watching, remembering the layout from old maps Thomas had studied. She was waiting when Crenshaw emerged. Her rifle trained on him. "Don't move," she said quietly. Crenshaw froze, then slowly turned. His fine clothes were filthy, his face gaunt with hunger and hate. "You!" he snarled. "This is all your fault." "No," Sarah said. "It's yours, your greed, your cruelty. Margaret's blood is on your hands." "Margaret was weak," he spat. "Like all women, like you." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, rage flooding through her. This man had killed Margaret, had tried to destroy everything she and Thomas had built. It would be so easy. "Sarah!" Samuel's voice came from behind her, calm and steady. "Don't. He's not worth it. Let the law have him." For a long moment, Sarah stood frozen, the rifle wavering. Then she thought of Margaret, of justice rather than revenge, of the home waiting for her and the future she might build. Slowly, she lowered the weapon. Watson and the others surrounded Crenshaw, binding his hands. As they led him away, he looked back at Sarah with pure hatred, but there was something else in his eyes now. Defeat. He'd lost everything to a woman he'd dismissed as weak, and that knowledge would torment him more than any prison. The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought. As they neared Sarah's homestead, Samuel spoke. "You could have shot him." "Many would have." "I'm not a killer," Sarah said simply. "I'm a homesteader. I protect what's mine, but I won't become like him." Samuel smiled, pride and love clear in his eyes. "Thomas was a lucky man, to have you. And if you'll have me, I'd like to be lucky too." This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. The past would always be part of her, but the future stretched ahead like the desert after rain, full of possibility. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Samuel, let's build something together." As they crested the last rise, her homestead came into view, battered but standing, a testament to survival and hope. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues, and somewhere in that light, Sarah felt Thomas's blessing and Margaret's peace. The stranger had claimed her homestead, but she'd held the deed, and Margaret's blood on it had indeed been the evidence that saved them all. Now, with Crenshaw facing justice and love blooming in the desert, Sarah McKenna looked toward tomorrow with hope renewed. The land was hers. The future was bright. And in this harsh, beautiful country, where death came easy, but life was precious, she had found both justice and joy. The trial was set for the following week, but Crenshaw's reach extended further than anyone had imagined. Despite being held in the town jail, he had managed to send word to his remaining associates, desperate men with nothing to lose who had profited from his schemes and now faced ruin if he testified against them. Sarah woke on the third night after Crenshaw's capture to the acrid smell of smoke. Fire! She leaped from bed, grabbing Thomas's rifle by instinct, and ran outside to see her barn ablaze. Flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like orange fingers. The horses were screaming, trapped inside. Without thinking, she ran toward the inferno. The heat was overwhelming, but she managed to throw open the barn doors. Her mare and the old plow horse burst out, eyes rolling in terror, their coats singed and smoking. Sarah stumbled back, coughing, her nightgown smoldering at the edges. More fires bloomed in the darkness. Her hay storage, the chicken coop, even the small tool shed Thomas had built their first year. This wasn't an accident. This was war. Gunfire erupted from the shadows. Sarah dove behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead, splintering wood and raising puffs of dust. She counted muzzle flashes, 4, maybe 5 shooters, positioned to catch her in a crossfire. "Give up, woman!" a voice called out. She recognized it as Briggs, one of Crenshaw's lieutenants who'd escaped the earlier raid. "You testify against Mr. Crenshaw. You won't live to see another sunset." Sarah's answer was a shot that sent Briggs diving for cover. She might be outnumbered, but this was her land. She knew every rock, every shadow, every line of sight. Moving low, she worked her way toward the house, firing sporadically to keep their heads down. A rider charged from the darkness, bearing down on her position. Sarah rolled aside as hooves thundered past, fired upward, and saw the rider tumble from his saddle. But there were too many, and they were closing in. Then, like salvation itself, she heard the thunder of approaching horses, many horses, riding hard. Samuel's voice rang out. "Sarah, where are you?" "Here," she called back, firing at a shadow that moved too close. The night exploded into chaos. It seemed half the town had come, not just Samuel and the Hendricks brothers, but shopkeepers and farmers, even some of the women, armed with whatever they could find. Word of the attack had spread quickly, and the community had finally had enough. Mary Hendricks rode alongside her husband, a shotgun across her saddle. "Nobody burns out our neighbors," she shouted, letting loose both barrels at the fleeing attackers. The battle was fierce but brief, faced with an angry mob of armed homesteaders. Crenshaw's men scattered like coyotes before wolves. 2 were captured, 3 escaped into the desert, and Briggs lay groaning in the dust, Mary's buckshot in his legs, as neighbors formed bucket brigades to fight the fires. Samuel found Sarah standing before the burning barn, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, holding her as she shook. "It's not just about the land anymore," she said, her voice raw from smoke. "They want me dead, want me silent. Then we make sure you're heard," Samuel said firmly. "And we make sure you're protected." The next days passed in a blur of preparation and tension. Sarah moved into town. Staying with Clara Hartley at the boarding house, armed men stood guard day and night. The federal prosecutor arrived, a stern man named Edwards, who listened to Sarah's story with growing anger. "This ends now," Edwards declared. "We'll move the trial to the federal court in Santa Fe. Let Crenshaw's money try to reach that far." But even as preparations were made, Sarah felt the weight of what was to come. To testify meant reliving Thomas's death, Margaret's tragedy, her own fear and struggle. And despite all precautions, she knew Crenshaw's men were still out there, waiting for an opportunity. The night before they were to leave for Santa Fe, Samuel came to her. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Tonight, before we go." Sarah stared at him, startled. "Samuel, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," he interrupted. "I won't let you face this alone. As your husband, I can protect you in ways I can't now. And," his voice softened, "if something happens, I want to have been your husband, even if only for a day." The wedding was small, held in Reverend Philip's parlor with Clara and the Hendricks as witnesses. Sarah wore a borrowed dress, Samuel his best shirt, hastily cleaned. It wasn't the wedding either had dreamed of, but as they spoke their vows by lamplight, with danger lurking in the darkness outside, the words carried a weight that fancy ceremonies could never match. "I, Samuel, take you, Sarah, to be my wife, to protect and cherish, in safety and in danger, in plenty and in want, until death us do part. I, Sarah, take you, Samuel, to be my husband, to stand beside you, in peace and in struggle, in joy and in sorrow, as long as we both shall live, when Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife." Sarah felt something shift inside her. The guilt she'd carried about moving on from Thomas eased. This wasn't a betrayal. It was life continuing, love growing even in the harshest ground. The journey to Santa Fe began at dawn. A heavily armed convoy surrounding the wagon that carried Sarah, Clara, and the precious documents. Samuel rode alongside, rifle ready, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Edwards had brought federal marshals, hard men who knew their business. Twice they spotted riders shadowing them at a distance. Once, they found the road blocked by fallen rocks, an obvious ambush point. But each time, the strength of their escort deterred attack. Crenshaw's remaining men were desperate but not suicidal. On the third day, as they camped by a stream, one of the marshals brought news. "3 riders coming in under a white flag, says they want to parley." Sarah watched from the wagon as the riders approached. She recognized one, Jackson, a gun hand who'd been with Crenshaw from the beginning. He looked haggard, defeated. "We're done," Jackson called out, hands raised. Briggs died from his wounds. Peterson and Wade lit out for Mexico. Ain't nobody left willing to die for a man who's already lost. "What do you want?" Edwards demanded. "Safe passage out of the territory." Jackson said, "In exchange, we'll testify. Tell what we know about Crenshaw's operations. The murders, all of it." Edwards looked to Sarah. It was her choice. Really, these men had terrorized her, burned her property, tried to kill her, but their testimony could ensure Crenshaw never hurt anyone again. "Let them go," she said quietly. "But they testify first, and if they lie or run," she looked directly at Jackson, "I'll hunt them down myself." Jackson nodded, understanding the promise in her words. The woman they dismissed as weak had proven to have more steel in her than any of them. The rest of the journey passed without incident. As they rolled into Santa Fe, Sarah marveled at the size of it, a real city, with stone buildings and proper streets. The federal courthouse stood like a fortress of justice, and for the first time in weeks, she felt truly safe. That night, in their hotel room, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse into Samuel's arms. The weight of everything, the fear, the fights, the constant vigilance, crashed over her like a wave. "You're the strongest woman I know," Samuel murmured, holding her close. "Tomorrow, you'll tell your story, and Crenshaw will face justice. Then we can go home, rebuild, start our life together properly." "Home," Sarah repeated, the word like honey on her tongue. Her barn was ash, her fences broken, but the land remained, their land now. "Yes, let's go home after this, make it better than before. Together," Samuel agreed. Outside their window, Santa Fe bustled with life, unaware of the drama about to unfold in its courthouse. But Sarah no longer felt like a small-town widow fighting alone against impossible odds. She had Samuel, had the support of her community, had the weight of federal law on her side. Tomorrow, she would face Silas Crenshaw across a courtroom instead of a gunfight. She would speak Margaret's truth, would hold up that blood-stained deed and demand justice, and then, win or lose, she would go home with her husband and rebuild. The stranger had claimed her homestead, but she had held the deed. Now it was time for the law to decide who truly owned the land, and whether Margaret's blood on that paper would finally bring her killer to justice. The federal courthouse in Santa Fe was packed to capacity on the morning of the trial. Word had spread throughout the territory about the widow who'd stood against Silas Crenshaw, and people had come from miles around to witness justice being served, or perverted, depending on their perspective. Sarah sat at the prosecutor's table, wearing the black dress Mary Hendricks had lent her, her hands folded calmly, though her heart raced. Beside her, Samuel sat protective and steady, while Clara Hartley occupied the row behind them. Across the aisle, Silas Crenshaw sat in chains, his expensive lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Even imprisoned, he managed to look arrogant, as if this were merely an inconvenience. Judge Harold Blackwood, sent from Washington specifically for this case, called the court to order. He was an imposing man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be easily fooled. The defendant stands accused of murder, fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. Judge Blackwood intoned, "How does he plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." Crenshaw's lawyer declared, "My client is a respected businessman, falsely accused by those who envy his success." Prosecutor Edwards rose. "The government will prove that Silas Crenshaw systematically stole land through forged documents, that he murdered his wife when she tried to expose him, and that he attempted to murder Mrs. Sarah Morrison when she discovered his crimes." Sarah noticed the use of her married name and squeezed Samuel's hand under the table. The prosecution began with Jackson, the gunman who'd turned state's evidence, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. He detailed Crenshaw's operations, the bribes, the forgeries, the intimidation. "Did Mr. Crenshaw ever speak of his wife?" Edwards asked. Jackson shifted nervously. "He said she was becoming a problem, said he'd handle her like he handled all problems, permanently." "Objection!" Crenshaw's lawyer shouted. "Hearsay. I'll allow it." Judge Blackwood ruled. "Continue." Then came Sarah's turn. She rose on unsteady legs, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom fell silent as she began her testimony. Starting with that day Crenshaw had appeared at her homestead. She spoke clearly, emotionally but not hysterically, as Edwards had coached her. She described finding Margaret's hidden documents, the blood-stained deed, the confrontation at Copper Creek. "Mrs. Morrison," Edwards said gently, "please show the court the deed Margaret Crenshaw gave you." Sarah produced the document, and gasps rippled through the courtroom at the sight of the bloodstains. She read aloud Margaret's desperate words, signed under threat of death. "My blood bears witness to his cruelty." "Objection!" the defense attorney cried. "That document could have been fabricated." "Then explain this," Edwards interrupted, producing more evidence. Margaret Crenshaw's journal, authenticated by 3 handwriting experts. Her letters to her sister, detailing the abuse and her husband's criminal plans. The original deeds found hidden at Copper Creek, proving the forgeries. The defense attorney fell silent. Clara Hartley testified next, her composure cracking as she described her sister's letters. The fear in every line. "Margaret knew she was going to die," Clara said, tears streaming. "She wrote to me, 'If something happens, look for a woman named Sarah McKenna. I've given her proof.'" The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source, Crenshaw's own accountant, a nervous man named Pembroke who'd been granted immunity. He detailed the financial crimes, showing ledgers that proved Crenshaw had paid for forged documents, bribed officials, and hired gunmen. "Did Mr. Crenshaw ever mention his wife's death?" Edwards asked. Pembroke swallowed hard. He said it was convenient, that she'd outlived her usefulness." A woman in the gallery cried out in disgust, and Judge Blackwood had to call for order. Finally, Crenshaw himself took the stand. His lawyer tried to paint him as a legitimate businessman beset by jealous neighbors, but Edwards destroyed that fiction with a surgical precision. "Mr. Crenshaw, is this your signature on these forged deeds?" "I don't recall." "Is this your handwriting in these letters discussing bribes?" "That could be anyone's." "Did you force your wife to sign false documents?" "Of course not." Edwards produced the blood-stained deed. "Then explain her blood on this paper. Explain her words." Crenshaw's composure finally cracked. "She was weak, hysterical. She didn't understand business." "So you killed her?" "I never said—" "You were seen near Cedar Creek the night she died, though you claimed to be in town. Witnesses have placed you there." Crenshaw's face went red, then white. "She was going to ruin everything. The stupid woman couldn't keep her mouth shut. I had plans, empire to build, and she—" He stopped, realizing what he'd said. The courtroom erupted. Judge Blackwood gavelled for silence. "Mr. Crenshaw, are you confessing to the murder of your wife?" Crenshaw's lawyer tried to intervene, but Crenshaw shoved him aside, his rage finally boiling over. Yes, I killed her. She betrayed me, tried to destroy what I'd built, just like that one." He pointed at Sarah. "Meddling women who don't know their place. I should have killed her too when I had the chance." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Judge Blackwood spoke, his voice heavy with disgust. "I've heard enough. This court finds sufficient evidence to bind Silas Crenshaw over for trial on all charges. Furthermore, given his confession in open court to murder, I'm recommending immediate transfer to federal prison to await execution." "No!" Crenshaw lunged toward Sarah, but the marshals restrained him. As they dragged him away, he screamed curses and threats, his dignity stripped away to reveal the monster beneath. The courtroom slowly emptied, people murmuring in shock and satisfaction. Sarah sat numbly as Edward shook her hand, as Clara embraced her, as well-wishers offered congratulations. It was over. Really, truly over. Outside, in the bright Santa Fe sunshine. Samuel pulled her close. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought him to justice." "We did it," Sarah corrected. "All of us, Margaret most of all." They returned to the homestead 3 days later to find their neighbors had already begun rebuilding. A new barn frame stood where the old had burned, and fresh lumber was stacked for repairs. The Hendricks, the Millers, even Jake Morrison, all had contributed. "This is what community means," Mary Hendricks said simply when Sarah tried to thank her. In the weeks that followed, as Crenshaw awaited execution and his conspirators faced their own trials, Sarah and Samuel worked to rebuild not just structures, but a life together. The land that had been threatened was now secure, the deed clear and uncontested. One evening, as they sat on their rebuilt porch watching the sunset, Sarah took out Margaret's photograph, the one Clara had given her. She'd had it framed and hung it in their home, a reminder of courage in the face of fear. "Do you think she knows?" Sarah asked softly. "That we got justice for her?" Samuel wrapped his arm around her. "I think she knows, and I think she's at peace." Sarah nodded, leaning into her husband's warmth. The stranger had claimed her homestead, but she had held the deed with his wife's blood on it. That blood had spoken louder than any lie, had brought truth to light and justice to a killer. The desert wind whispered across their land, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Somewhere in that vast sky, the first stars were beginning to appear. Sarah thought of Thomas, of Margaret, of all the dreams that had been broken and rebuilt in this harsh, beautiful land. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked. Sarah smiled, her hand finding his. "I'm thinking about the future, about the children we'll raise here, the crops we'll grow, the life we'll build. I'm thinking that sometimes the darkest times bring the strongest light." "To the future, then," Samuel said, kissing her forehead. "To the future." Sarah agreed. "And to those who helped us reach it." As full darkness fell over the New Mexico territory, Sarah Morrison sat with her husband on the land they'd fought to keep, at peace at last. The deed was theirs. The truth had prevailed, and love had grown from the ashes of loss. In the vast tapestry of the American West, their story was but one thread, but it was golden, woven with courage, justice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to surrender to tyranny. The stranger had come claiming what wasn't his, but in the end, it was truth that claimed its rightful place, written in blood that could never be washed away. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please leave a comment and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sarah's journey. What did you think of her courage? Could you have stood up to someone like Crenshaw? Let's discuss in the comments below.